or you're telling a story. The first one you might call the stage setting context. Okay? Now, the way maybe you might think of this is if you're watching a Star Wars film, okay? So anybody that's ever watched a Star Wars film knows what to expect, right, when it starts. You're going to have the words, and they're going to float up the screen, and what does that do? It sets the stage. It gives you a context for the film, right? It gives you a context of the action that you're about to see. And Jesus often in his parables gave this sort of stage setting context, or in this case, Luke, in writing his gospel, gives us that stage setting context. And let's read it. It begins in verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he, Jesus, said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Okay, so before we get into the parable, this sort of sets the stage, right? There's a man, and apparently he and his brother are having some kind of disagreement about an inheritance. I've been involved in an inheritance dispute before. It's not fun. And evidently, these two brothers are having a difficult time because of some disagreement about an inheritance. Now, you might think, and this is sort of the way I think about it, what better person to go to talk about this problem than Jesus? Because this guy, he thinks obviously that this is a matter of injustice. This is a matter of a lack of fairness. And Jesus often would talk about justice, right? Jesus would often talk about fairness. And so he thinks Jesus probably cares about this injustice that's being done to me. Jesus probably cares that I'm not being treated fairly, and so I'm going to bring this problem to Jesus. But notice how Jesus responds. Two ways. The first thing is he says, "I'm not your judge or arbitrator in this matter." So first of all, it seems that Jesus, he doesn't say you shouldn't be worried about inheritances. He doesn't say you shouldn't be concerned about justice or fairness. But he says, I'm not the judge or arbitrator of this matter. So maybe Jesus thinks there's somebody that's in a better position to deal with this particular issue. Maybe a local rabbi. Maybe the elders down at the local synagogue are more in tune with the actual problem, and maybe they're better suited to deal with this issue. So Jesus says, I'm not the judge or arbitrator. He didn't say, I'm not your judge or arbitrator at all, just in this matter. The second thing Jesus says, though, is that this problem seems to be centered around greed, okay? Just notice he says, beware or be on guard against all kinds of greed. So the two reasons that Jesus refuses to get involved are, number one, maybe I'm not the best one suited for this, and number two, this seems to be a problem with greed. If you're willing to throw away your relationship with each other for stuff, for things, that's a problem. And I'm not going to get involved in that. I'm not going to help you do that. Okay? That's the stage setting context of this parable. Now, I said there were two aspects of context. The second one is stuff embedded in the story itself. How people interact with each other, how people interact with their environment, how people interact with things. That's part of the context internal to the story. So people interact with each other, people interact with their surroundings, and within a story, there are always going to be interpretive clues seeing how people interact with each other, seeing how people interact with their surroundings, that tell us something about the story, how to make sense of the story. And that's the parable itself. So let's read the parable one more time and see if we might pick out some interpretive clues to help us make sense of all this. So he tells them the parable. Verse 16, the land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, what should I do, for I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? Okay. First thing that I notice as I read this parable, it's the first noun in the story, is land. Okay? The land. Okay? The land of a rich man produced abundantly. So let's start there. That seems to be important. Think about land. Think about what land would have meant to someone in Jesus' day. Think about what land would have meant to an ancient Israelite. I think there are obvious regular mundane things that would make land very important in Jesus' day. Jesus grew up in an agricultural-based economy, right? And so land was really important. If you had land and you were growing crops, what could that land do? Well, think about it. Before the advent of corporate farming, what did people do when they farmed? What did people do when they raised crops? Well, the first thing you do, I assume, is that you take whatever you're raising and you feed your family with it, right? Okay. Now, if you have more than enough to feed your family, or you have one maybe specific crop and your family needs other items as well, what can you do? You can take the excess and you can barter or trade that commodity for something else that you need, right? So that's two ways that you would use crops. You could benefit from land. And then if you've fed your family and you've bartered, then what can you do? You can take it to market and you can sell it, right? And then the proceeds that you get from the sale of that product, that can go into next year's crop, right? And so if you have access to land in an agricultural-based economy, you're at an advantage, aren't you? But think about what land might have meant to an ancient Israelite spiritually. You remember one of the promises that God made to Abraham? What? I will give you a land. I will give you a land. So not only would it help somebody economically, not only would it help somebody feed their family, but it connected them to God. And it connected them to God's people. It's something about faith. And so access to land indicated something about somebody's relationship to God. And that's why I think God was so concerned about people that didn't have land. Because it was an agricultural-based economy, if you didn't have land, you were in a difficult situation. You might not be able to feed your family. And two, it had something to do with faith. So think about it. In Deuteronomy, for instance, the Israelites were told, if you have a grove of olive trees, and you can look at the olive trees and you can see that they're getting ripe. A couple of them have fallen to the ground. It's time to harvest those olives. And how do you do it? You go up to the branch and you start shaking the branches to get those olives to fall off the tree when they're ripe. And then you gather them up. In Deuteronomy, the ancient Israelites were told, you go shake that branch, that olive tree, to get those ripe olives. Don't shake it twice. Shake it once. Gather what falls to the ground. Don't shake it again. Why? Because you're going to leave that for the stranger, the foreigner, the widow, the orphan, so they can have something. The landless people to have something. In Leviticus, when you get ready to harvest your land, whether it's a summer harvest or a fall harvest, don't harvest all the way to the edges of your property. You leave the edges unharvested. And don't go back over that twice. You leave what you drop. You leave what's left over. Why? That's for the foreigner. That's for the stranger. That's for the orphan. That's for the widow. God cares about people that don't have land, that don't have economic advantages. And then back to that faith, that it connects you to their faith. Over and over again, the Israelites were warned, don't move the ancient landmarks. Don't move the boundary lines. Why? Because not only did that mean economic security for a family, but that meant a connection to God, because that's part of the Abrahamic promise. And so this is important. So this man is being blessed. He has land. He's blessed economically, and he can think about how it connects him to God if he so chooses. The second interpretive clue takes up a lot of this parable. And did you notice in the parable, this rich man begins to talk to himself? Okay. So in Luke's gospel, there are a couple of different times, and these are really important that you need to recognize in these stories that Jesus tells. There are a couple of times when the main protagonist in a story, the main character, talks to himself. The main character comes to himself. And usually what that implies is some kind of change. A positive change, hopefully. So for instance, in the parable of the prodigal son, as we call it. Well, the younger son, right, he takes the inheritance. There's inheritance, right? Okay, that's important. He takes the inheritance and he wastes it, and he finds himself in a pig pen, right? And he's feeding the pigs, and he wishes he could eat what they were eating. And then what? He comes to himself and he talks to himself and he says, oh, I need to go. Even the servants, the hired hands in my father's house do better than I'm doing. And he makes a decision. I'm going back home. Well, that's what happens here. This man begins to talk to himself, but it doesn't lead to a decision to go back home or a positive decision in one's relationship with God or one's relationship in the community. It leads to selfishness and foolishness. So what does he say? He thought to himself, what should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. He said, I'll do this. I'll pull down my barns. I'll build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Okay, so he has a conversation with himself. And he says, I don't have enough room to store this abundant harvest. I'm going to tear down my old barns and I'm going to build new barns. All of that, right? A couple of things. That doesn't really make much economic sense, does it? Now, I don't know a lot about economics, and I'm certainly no expert in farming, okay? But I do know this. You can't store a crop in a barn or in a silo and it maintain its quality indefinitely. You've probably got, under the best of circumstances, you might have 6 months to a year where that crop remains marketable, that you could use yourself or sell. You're not going to be able to just store stuff in a silo and then 5 years later or 10 years later use it for food or selling it at market. It's going to be useless. This guy's not making good economic decisions, first of all, okay? The second thing is, did you notice this conversation? What does he say? How many times does the personal pronoun I come up? Notice what he says? What should I do? I have no place to store my crops. I will do this. I will store. I will say. He seems to have bought into a myth. This is a myth that became widely accepted in the United States in probably starting really in the mid-19th century. And that's the myth of a self-made man. And it becomes part of our cultural mythos, doesn't it? It becomes part of the culture of the way we think about ourselves. I built my company. I built this. I did it all by myself. Now, do you think this man planted a large enough crop that it produced abundantly and harvested it and would build new barns and move the crops into the new barns? Do you think he would do all of that by himself? He would not do all of that by himself. He would not be able to do all of that by himself. That's the way he thinks about it. I did this myself. He doesn't mention any relatives. If he has a wife, he doesn't mention her. If he has kids, he doesn't mention them. If he has workers that work the field, he doesn't say anything about them. What about a bonus for the field hands? Any mention of that? No, it's all about himself, isn't it? I did this. I have been able to produce an abundant crop. I've stored it. It's all about me. That's the second thing that you notice in the text. And then finally, one more. It's certainly not all of them. But I think one more interpretive clue is time. Time. So the first thing I notice in regard to time is that this man says, you have goods laid up for many years. We all kind of assume, don't we, that we're going to be around for many years, as he says. But you know, even if we live what's sometimes called a long life, that life's not really long, is it? Not really. We have a very finite, short amount of time in this world. And this man seems to take that for granted and assume all of that's laid out for me. And I'm going to use this time for myself to, what does he say? Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But then the second time you see time mentioned is, and this is really interesting, here God becomes part of the story, and God speaks to this man. And he says, you're a fool. Why? This very night. What you thought was this long life laid out there for many years in which you were going to be able to relax and enjoy yourself and enjoy all this abundance of things is really going to end tonight, he says. And God concludes, then if your life is about things, then who are these things going to belong to that you've prepared? Time. And I think what Jesus is trying to tell us about time is that all we have is right now. What are we doing right now? Not to satisfy ourselves, but what are we doing right now to bless others? What are we doing right now? Not what you're going to do a year from now or 10 years from now. When I retire, I'm going to do this or that. No. What are you doing right now? Because that's all you have. That's all we're promised. And it's kind of scary, isn't it, the way God talks about it? And we've probably all known people that have experienced sudden death, right? You think you're going to have this long life, and if you think you're going to be able to prepare for death, and you're going to be able to make plans and make good decisions, and then all of a sudden, face all the time. And then finally, after Jesus tells the story, he makes application. That makes for a good story, right? Jesus says, "So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Rich toward God. I don't know exactly what that means, but I think I know what it looks like based on the story. What does it mean to be rich toward God? I think it means to first make good decisions about how you help other people. Be generous. This man talks about storing his crops. And I talked about how that was a foolish economic decision, right? Because the crops are going to spoil. But you know what else? That's a foolish community decision, isn't it? Because other people could be blessed by those crops. Either by selling them at market or by giving them to people who have need, and all he's doing is hoarding. So to be rich toward God means to be generous to other people, I think. The second thing it means, I think, is to not be so much focused on yourself. Not so much to be focused on myself. It's not about, I did this, I did that, I am going to do this. I'm going to make these plans. Being rich toward God has to mean we in community, serving together, helping each other, working through this life together. And then being rich toward God means you recognize that right here is all I have. And where I put myself in this moment tells something about what I value. How I talk to people in this moment tells something about what I value. Whether I'm concerned about those that are the most vulnerable in our culture right now in society, that tells something about what I value. In some way, that's what it means to be rich toward God. I don't know if I'm rich toward God, but something to shoot for, isn't it? Something to do your best at. And so, stories act on us, don't they? They tell us something about our world. They tell us something about ourselves. They tell us something about the communities in which we live. And especially Jesus' stories do this. And so tonight, as we reflect on this text, are we being rich toward God? And the funny thing is, being rich toward God probably means something about how we treat each other. If we can pray with you, help you, assist you in any way in doing that, we want to offer you that opportunity. Maybe there's somebody that would like to receive baptism tonight. I know there are people here that will help you in that obedience. Maybe you need prayers. Maybe you need help. Maybe you're struggling with what's going on right now in your life, and you want to make the most of it. We offer you the opportunity to express that. We'll be happy to pray with you and help you in any way that we can.